All right, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Summers, the Academic Director for the University of Alberta's Sustainability Council. And throughout the year, the Sustainability Council hosts a number of talks with interdisciplinary scholars and professionals and activists who engage with sustainability, climate change, and environmental issues in general. We have these about every 2 weeks, so be sure to check out our calendar online for upcoming talks. But before we start today's talk, I just want to note that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and that we respect the history, language, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I'd personally encourage all of you to take the time to learn about the treaties and about unceded land in Canada and as much about our history learn about our history so that you have a basis of the understanding of how Canada evolved over time and the impacts on all peoples. So for the benefit for those of you who could not be with us today, we will be recording this lecture and we'll publish it on our YouTube channel. So if there's someone that would like to have seen it and you're aware of that, you can share that information with them. As Justice mentioned, the audience will not appear in the published video. So you're fine leaving your camera on if you like, or turning your camera off, whichever you prefer. I'll note that we will have time for some questions at the end. So if you have questions, you're welcome. You don't need to hold them to the end. You can just throw them in the chat and we will watch the chat and I will moderate at the end and I'll take a selection of the questions. And, we don't often have time for all of the questions. So if you put one in there and it's not answered, don't feel bad. I'm just grabbing those that I can see and that trying to get a diversity of topics. All right. So with all of that noted, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Sherilee L. Harper is the Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health and an Associate Professor at the School of Public Health in the University of Alberta. Her research investigates associations between weather, environment, and public health in the context of climate change, and she collaborates with partners across sectors to prioritize climate-related health actions, planning interventions, and research. She's a lead author on the Ipcc Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere and a Changing Climate, lead author on the Ipcc's Sixth Assessment Report. She served on the Gender Task Group for the Ipcc, and serves on the editorial board of Epidemiology and Infection, PLOS Climate, and Frontiers in Climate. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sherilee for our talk today.
Thanks so much for that introduction. It's so great to be here today. All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the most recent Ipcc report, which was just dropped on Monday. And I'm specifically going to be focusing in on what that report tells us about human health. The report's several hundred pages long, so I'm going to focus in and talk about what the report's main messages mean in the context of human health. So just to give you an overview of how much work and effort and science goes into these reports, I'm just presenting the reports by the numbers here. So this most recent Ipcc assessment, we assessed almost 35,000 different research articles. It was a collaboration of over 270 authors from 67 different countries. This report had 41% female authors, which is a record for Ipcc. And it's peer-reviewed several times. And we actually had over 60,000 different peer review comments that we had to respond to one by one, which are also part of the public record. Now, this process is really critically important, and these reports are really important because they not only provide the latest science that's available on climate change and what it means for humanity, but it's also a really important part of a governance process. So this report was just recently on Sunday morning approved by 195 different countries, different UN member states, and it underpins climate negotiations. So for the past 2 weeks, we've been working through the summary for policymakers with these different governments, 195 governments, almost 1,000 delegates from different countries, answering questions about the summary for policymakers, rewording things to make it more clear or more policy relevant. And at the end of the day, they approve these reports and they say, yes, we agree with the science, we understand the science, And then that underpins the future negotiations that happen in terms of climate change. So this includes things like, in the past, it included the Kyoto Protocol, it includes the Paris Agreement. Last year, it included the COP26 at Glasgow, and this upcoming year, it's going to include the negotiations that happen at COP27 in Egypt. So this is a really important document, not just for science, but also for the governance of climate change. So this is the main conclusion from the report. The scientific evidence is unequivocal that climate change is a threat to human beings and to the health of the planet. And any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing windows to secure a livable future. And the report is intended to offer solutions to the world. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of my presentation is talk about this in the context of human health. So I think that most Canadians now are no stranger to some of the climate extremes that we've been experiencing. If you just think about the past year, we had the unprecedented heat wave that's nothing like we've ever seen anywhere in North America before, the heat dome that swept through the country in the summer. We've had record numbers of wildfires in Canada and the United States. We've had flooding in British Columbia. We've had droughts in the prairies. We've had increased storms, and the report covers all of these different extreme climate events and assesses the impacts of those. But we also look at slower onset events, so things like gradual warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and the impacts that those have. And one key message of the report is that the impacts that these different climate events are having on society are more widespread, they're more wide sweeping, they're more severe, and they're happening a lot faster than we previously thought they would happen. And this has huge impacts on every facet of our life. It has impacts on our infrastructure, on our economy, on our culture, on our livelihoods. And what really stands out for me in the report is how it impacts our health. And so the report documents how climate change has already impacted the health of millions of people in North America and billions of people in the world, and how this is going to continue to happen into the future. Past reports have also covered this. So the last major assessment from the Ipcc was done in 2014, and they did cover a number of different climate change impacts on health. So things like waterborne disease, foodborne disease, how it's increasing heat-related morbidity and mortality, how air pollution is impacted and how that impacts our health. But what I wanted to spend a little bit more time on today are some of the new findings of the report. So while past reports have looked at how climate change impacts vector-borne disease, this is the first time that an in-depth assessment has been done for North America specifically. So the report shows how changing environmental conditions are changing the seasonal activity of different disease vectors, so things like mosquitoes and ticks. So they're popping up earlier in the year because the seasons are getting warmer, so that the seasonal activity of the ticks and the mosquitoes are longer. The range of these different vectors is expanding, so things are popping up in new places where they weren't before, and this increases the risk of transmission. So one thing that the report highlights is how Lyme disease has actually increased in Canada and the United States, and there's a clear climate change fingerprint in that. Another example in the report is how, looking into the future, even by mid-century and definitely by the end of this century, how things like chikungunya could come up to Canada as well, especially in the southern parts of British Columbia. Another more in-depth focus is malnutrition. So in the last report, there was a focus on malnutrition, but it was more of a focus for more faraway places. And this is the first time that the report really looks in depth at malnutrition in North America, so including in Canada and including in the United States. So the report looks at a lot of different facets of this, including things like how climate change is changing crop yields, which can impact our caloric intake. But the real focus of the report this time is looking at how it changes the diversity of foods that will become available to us. So this includes things like, if there's an extreme event and it's really hard on a particular crop, that impacts the types of food that we have available to us in the grocery store. And it also impacts the price of the food that's in the grocery store. And the report outlines how that has already impacted nutrition in Canada and the United States, and how it will continue to do so in the future. Another aspect of the report for North America, it looks at how future changes in climate change due to climate change could also change the nutrient content of certain types of food. So with increased carbon dioxide in the air, that can change the nutritional content of certain crops, which can impact the nutritional availability in that food to people. And then the third area, which is very new for IPCC, is looking at how climate change is impacting mental health. So in the past, the last major report in 2014, there just wasn't a lot of research that was done in this area. But since then, there's been a huge amount of research looking at how climate change is impacting mental health. So this is the first time that we were able to assess it in depth. And we looked at it through 3 different pathways. So we looked at how climate change can directly impact mental health. And that includes things like after a wildfire or a flood event or some sort of major climate extreme. And if people have to be evacuated from their homes or they experience property damage, those events are obviously very stressful. And research has shown a clear link to increased post-traumatic stress, increased anxiety, and other mental health challenges. But climate change can also indirectly impact mental health. So a clear example that's provided in the report is how climate change is impacting certain different occupations. So for example, if a farmer experiences a drought and that impacts their crops and it impacts their livelihoods, that has been associated with increased mental health challenges. And so climate change can indirectly impact mental health as well. Another example from North America is in the Canadian Arctic, where Inuit have been impacted by climate change, particularly as it relates to food security. And so if it's harder to navigate over sea ice and the conditions are more unsafe, that's obviously very stressful conditions to be working within, but it also impacts people's ability to secure food, to hunt and to fish. And that impacts the food that they're eating on a day-to-day basis, which is also associated with mental health challenges. And then the third way that the report covers climate change impacts on mental health is how we vicariously experience mental health or how we vicariously experience climate change through the eyes of other people. So for example, here in Alberta, watching the devastating flooding that was happening in British Columbia can be really stressful. Seeing these images of devastated landscapes, of damaged infrastructure, of loss and despair, seeing those types of images can also be associated with increased mental health challenges and also strong emotional responses. So this area of vicariously experiencing the climate change impacts through other people's experiences is an increasing area of research, and we assess that in the report. But of course, these impacts are not equitably or evenly distributed throughout the world. The report shows that there's 3.3 billion to 3.6 billion people currently live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And so you can look at this at a regional level. So you can say places like the Arctic or places like Africa are definitely experiencing more of these impacts than other places of the world. You could also look at it at a country to country level. But what the report also shows in a lot more detail this time is how certain segments of subpopulations are impacted. So for instance, the heat wave that we experienced last summer, even though we were all exposed to the heat wave, different people were more severely impacted by the heat wave than others. And that often links to socioeconomic conditions. It links to access to services. It's also linked to things like access to resources, marginalization, discrimination, racism. All of these things come into play. And the report clearly covers that. In fact, in the summary for policymakers, it's the very first time that the word colonialism has been approved by the member states. And it's now officially recognized as a core source of vulnerability to climate change, which is a huge milestone for IPCC. And the report shows that these risks are becoming more and more complex. And as they become more and more complex, they become more and more challenging to manage. But, and also I should say that every small increase of warming results in increased risks. So even a little bit of climate change matters. But at the same time, the report also points to solutions. So while we know that these risks are happening a lot faster than we had ever anticipated, we also know that there are solutions. And the report looks at different adaptation strategies that can protect public health, that can reduce climate change risks, that are both effective and feasible. But at the same time, we also know that as warming increases, these different adaptation strategies or responses become less and less effective. The report also shows that these types of strategies and initiatives are very unevenly spread throughout the world. And in fact, places that are most hit by climate change often have the least number of adaptation strategies that have been implemented. So what are the options that we can take to reduce risk? In the context of health, the report covers things that we know work. So for instance, we know that heat plans work, and we know that early warning systems work for heat waves. So if we do these things, we know that we can reduce more heat-related morbidity and mortality after a major heat wave. So this includes things like opening up cooling stations or centers in cities, handing out water, opening up places that people can cool down, including public pools or things like that. It also includes things like campaigns to reach out to your neighbors to make sure that everyone's okay, to check in on each other. Other adaptation options that are assessed in the report include things like better integrating mental health services into emergency response and planning. But the report also shows that actually most of the health benefits that can be gained from climate change adaptation actually happen outside of the health sector. So this includes things like really bolstering food security initiatives, improving drinking water quality, including infrastructure upgrades in major cities to make sure that our water treatment infrastructure is climate resilient. And it also includes things like increasing and improving green spaces in cities, which we know can reduce the heat island effect and also have benefits during heat waves. But at the same time, we know that the effectiveness of these strategies declines with increased warming, and there are very clear limits to adaptation. So for example, offering green spaces in cities is really effective when we know that has a cooling effect. But it only works to a certain extent. And if the heat waves are too extreme, for example, like the one we saw this past summer, quite frankly, green spaces won't protect public health. We also know that heat plans and early warning systems only work to a certain extent, that humans can only survive in certain types of temperatures. So it's really important to remember that while these adaptation strategies exist, that there is a limit to these adaptations. And at the same time, we really need to be focusing on reducing our emissions. The report talks a lot about key things that will enable us to accelerate adaptation. This includes, mobilizing institutional frameworks, enhancing knowledge and awareness. Monitoring and evaluation is something that came up a lot, which isn't currently widespread done right now, but we need to know what's effective and what's being done where, as well as things like inclusive governance. We also pay attention to maladaptation. So this is the idea that a strategy might be put in place in the short term, which will hopefully, protect public health or reduce whatever climate change risk. But in the long term, there's actually unintended consequences that can increase vulnerability to climate change. And one area that the report focuses on, for example, is that if you don't address underlying issues of inequity, discrimination, racism, and colonialism, that any adaptation effort that we put into place in the long term will actually be ineffective and increase vulnerability for certain groups. In terms of limits to adaptation, I spoke a little bit about that, but it has to go hand in hand with climate change mitigation. So reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and really trying to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the Paris Agreement sets out to do. If we exceed 1.5 degrees, even temporarily, we know that the risks will increase. And if we hit 2 degrees of global warming, the report clearly shows that most of our adaptation strategies that we have available to protect public health will no longer be effective, and our healthcare system could be very easily overwhelmed. Another key message of the report is that while we know what adaptation actions are effective and what we need to do, there's enough knowledge that we know what we need to do, but we need to act now because the window of opportunity for action is closing rapidly. And so what does that look like? What do we need to do to try and achieve a climate resilient future? Well, in addition to paying attention to things like specific adaptation strategies to grapple with specific climate change risks, and in addition to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we also have to think about how we can develop a climate resilient future. And in the report, we talk about things like the importance of partnerships. We talk about drawing from multiple knowledge bases, so Western science, but also Indigenous knowledge and science, and other sources of information. We talk about the importance of conserving and restoring ecosystems, that part of the solution is actually protecting and conserving the environment. It involves engaging with and prioritizing marginalized groups, as well as including concepts of equity and justice into everything that we do. It includes also, really scaling up investment and international cooperation between different places around the world. So the report also, if you read the summary for policymakers, it's pretty clear that, quite frankly, we are not on track for achieving a climate resilient future. And it shows that that window of opportunity is really narrowing. So we really need to start taking action now. And that every decision that we make right now will either take us closer to or further away from a climate resilient future. So the time for action is now. So that's our report in a nutshell, and what it means for health. And now I'm really looking forward to questions, to discussion on the report, and what it means for health, or what it means for any of us within or outside of the health sector. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sherilee. For those of you watching, if you could just put your questions in the chat and I'll watch for those. I'll start with this. I mean, sometimes as you lay out all the challenges, and I know I've done this myself, and, you can kind of start to feel hopeless. And I'm wondering if there's anything you could say to the audience around, what aspects or where do you find hope moving forward, or how do you focus your efforts?
I mean, I think this is a question that all the authors grappled with for the past 3 years, because it's really hard. It's really hard to be constantly talking about and assessing all of these impacts. And one of the major findings of the report is that these impacts are happening a lot faster, and they're a lot more widespread and a lot more devastating than we had previously thought. So, spending a significant amount of our time looking at these and talking about them is really hard. The report, though, also does focus on solutions and shows that, climate change isn't a climate issue, it's a people issue. People need to take action and need to mobilize. Personally, on a personal level, besides the report, I think that what gives me hope is seeing how much the climate change discourse has changed. Even in the past 5 years, we've seen youth going to the streets, asking for decision makers to pay attention to the science and to specifically, be accountable to the Ipcc reports and the science that governments have agreed to within those reports. I've seen people talk about climate change more than they ever have in the past. I've seen climate change be a top election issue from municipal levels all the way up to national levels in terms of politics. And I've also seen people keep the topic of climate change on the radar of their elected officials. So it's not just an election issue, but it's becoming more and more of an everyday issue. So those are the types of things that give me hope. And I think that type of like broad scale systemic action is what's really needed in terms of climate change. And while our individual actions matter, what matters even more, and what the report shows matters even more, is this collective international action that's required to grapple with this.
Great. So here's a question from Anita. She asked, what lessons have been learned from previous Ipcc reports in terms of policy prioritization and policy implementation? So that's a big question. So what are the lessons learned regarding, prioritization and implementation regarding policy?
Yeah, and I'm not sure about past reports, but I can say for this report, we'll have to see how this goes. I mean, this report is going to underpin the negotiations that happen at COP27 in Egypt. I think that that COP is going to have a huge focus on adaptation, especially given the location that it's in. It's in an African country, and Africa overall has been experiencing huge impacts of climate change and needs adaptation efforts to be bolstered. I mean, I know it does matter, because if you look at those negotiations, these reports do underpin them, and their reference to them in the agreements. But the truth is that so far we haven't been meeting our commitments that we've made so far. And I think that COP27 is going to be a really important one, because that's when governments and countries are going to start to be held accountable. And that's when things like the global stocktake, which sort of monitors progress on adaptation and mitigation, is really going to start to come into play. The other thing that's come out of this and out of these COP discussions are the nationally determined contributions, which each country has to make and outline what they're doing to both reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but also to increase adaptation efforts in their country. And within Canada, that spurred things like the National Adaptation Strategy, which is right now being developed by the federal government, and other initiatives too. So I think it does have an impact. I think that we are falling short, but I'm hopeful that will change. Okay. And then I think the other thing that I'll just mention on this topic is this issue of colonialism, and I think that's particularly important for Indigenous peoples, especially in Canada. And I think that this report is also a really important step forward for Ipcc, because it's acknowledging the role that this plays in climate change vulnerability. And it also is acknowledging the important role that Indigenous self-determination and climate change governance is in terms of grappling with climate change. So I'm also hopeful that we'll start to see that become more of a priority in these international arenas.
Okay, great. So there's a question here. Oh, I lost the name of the person. Basically, the question was, at what level should people, and I think the notion is in terms of advocacy, should they target their efforts municipal, federal, provincial? Is there a level of government that we should be seeking to influence with our efforts?
I think it's at all levels, because we have to come together across scales and different things. There's different jurisdictional responsibility over different things, and it requires us all to work together across those different levels of government. At the municipal level, there's things like green spaces, transportation that could be bolstered and improved and become more sustainable, bike lanes, things like that happen at a municipal level. At a provincial level in Canada, for example, that's where our healthcare decisions are made. The health sector is actually one of the highest emitting greenhouse gas emitting sectors that there is, besides agriculture. So, I think that's important. And at a federal level, that's where we see a lot of funds mobilized both within the country, but also where a lot of finance comes to other countries that are disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change, but who contributed least to the problem.
Okay, great. So this is from Nada, and it says, there have been some reports that new public health threats may come with ice caps melting from bacteria and viruses that are trapped in ice from long ago. Is this addressed in the Ipcc report, or are there any other comments you have on that?
Yeah, it's addressed in 2 of the chapters. So I definitely recommend checking those out. It's not just in ice caps, but it's also in permafrost. So a really good example of that is some of the permafrost thaw that happened in the Arctic, and it's releasing anthrax. And a lot of reindeer herds have been impacted by that, including like massive impacts in Siberia, where entire herds had to be culled because of anthrax, which not only impacts those herds, but it also impacts the food security of the people who rely on them. It impacts their culture, it impacts their identity, and it even killed one boy. So these things are not just hypothetical, they're things that have already started to happen. Yeah, they're no longer, what this report shows is that a lot of these climate change threats that we talk about are no longer things that are distantly in the future. We're starting to see them happen now, which is a lot faster than past reports projected it would happen.
Okay, great. This is from Ziting, and the question is should water vapor in the atmosphere be considered a greenhouse gas? Why is it considered or neglected in the calculation of radiative forcing?
That's a really interesting question. And I will say that for my other Ipcc colleagues. So this past summer, there was a report, the Working Group 1 report was released in August, which focuses on climate change science itself. So what the projections are. In our report, then we take those projections and say, okay, what do these climate changes that we've already seen and these climate changes that we're projecting to see in the future, what do they mean for humanity? What do they mean for ecosystems? And then in about 6 weeks or so, the third report in this 3-series report will be released, and it focuses on mitigation and specifically what types of things, both like social programming as well as technologies need to be developed to reduce our emissions and to try and help us meet 1.5 degrees warming.
Yeah, that's why interdisciplinarity in these efforts is so important. We can't know the entirety of everything. Okay, so Alex asks, while developing this report, what was your experience of evaluating the impact of climate change on the mental health of Indigenous communities in Canada and across Africa? Is this fully reflected in the report?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. This is the first time that Ipcc has assessed mental health. And there's a section, there's an entire section in the report on mental health in the Arctic, in Indigenous populations in the Arctic. There's in the North America chapter, there's a section on mental health, which includes how it's impacting the mental health of Indigenous peoples. Specifically in Africa, there's an African chapter, and they also have a mental health section where they talk about what's known about climate change and mental health for Africans. It's included in actually most of the regional chapters. And there's a really nice figure, if you're interested in looking at it more, in the summary for policymakers, which outlines what regions climate change impacts on mental health have been studied and assessed in the report. And you'll see that it's actually been studied and assessed in almost all of the regions globally. And across regions, it's all negative impacts very, very clearly.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one of my own, and then I'll jump back to the chat. So, one of the challenges I face when I engage with social science colleagues on various issues around climate change and other things is that there's sometimes conflict, within those communities. We can all be really concerned about climate change, but I'll take one specific example: carbon taxes, for example, which I think are a critical tool, in my mind, probably one of the most important approaches we can take to radically transform things. And yet there will be, and I appreciate, I think we can integrate different approaches, and we need to, but there will be people who say, no, this is just, colonial capitalist legacies. This is just pushing corporate solutions to climate change, and we should not do this. And so how do you deal with, those types of internal conflicts within advocates for change?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that specific issue specifically, but I can talk to that situation in general. And the Ipcc structure is set up to accommodate that. So basically, it's our job as authors in the assessment process to assess the science that's available, and that's primarily through the peer-reviewed literature. I mean, there's other sources of evidence that we take into consideration, but it's primarily, so far, according to Ipcc rules, the peer-reviewed literature. And there are these debates that happen, and the Ipcc has this calibrated language that decision makers have become very familiar with. And basically we can talk about not only the amount of evidence that's available on the topic, but the agreement like across studies on that evidence. And so it gives us the ability to talk about things that might seem like they're potentially like on the fringe of science, but have promise, and signal to policymakers using this Ipcc calibrated language what that means. And also flag areas where we have really strong scientific consensus on certain risks or solutions. So that's one mechanism. And then I think that, I mean, the Ipcc is this amazing thing because, like I said at the beginning, there were literally hundreds of authors that came together on this topic, and tens of thousands of peer review comments that came in that we had to respond to one at a time. It's all part of the public record. And then layered on top of that is this government approval process where we literally go through the summary for policymakers line by line, word by word, and answer questions and clarify things and make it as clear as possible. So I think that like that there's room for that built in, but it's certainly challenging. It's certainly challenging, but they try to incorporate ways to communicate that to decision makers.
With all of that scrutiny, I'm almost amazed that it ever actually gets published, having to go through all of the countries and get agreement.
Well, I can tell you that I didn't get very much sleep the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, there's a question from Helen and Dave in the chat that says, in addressing the challenges we face, how do we foster cooperative, respectful relationships that address common interest and mutual well-being rather than self-interest?
I think that's a critical question, and I think that's going to be key to achieving this climate resilient future that we want to get towards. I guess another thing that gives me hope in that context is even thinking back over my past 2 weeks, where 195 different countries with very different priorities came together on this to try and come to a common understanding on what the scientific evidence is on climate change. And even though each government has very different priorities, and government delegations are very interesting, like some government delegations are like completely lawyers because the stakes are high for certain governments in terms of what's in the report and how it's communicated, because that directly impacts the climate change negotiation process. But at the end of the day, everyone comes together and science has the final word. And I think that type of cooperation gives me hope, but how to achieve that in a way that's needed to achieve a climate resilient future, I think is something that we have to start working towards.
Okay, great. So Candace Nikiforak, who you know, asked the question, what is the potential role of public health funders to support increased meaningful action?
That's a good question. I think that, personally, I think that there's many things that this requires. One is it requires more specific funding for this area. If you were to apply to CIHR, one of the tri-councils that is primarily responsible for health research, sometimes it's really hard to communicate the need to work with natural scientists and climate modelers and the social scientists as well on your project, without CIHR saying, oh, that's an NSERC project or that's a SSHRC project. And so having these interdisciplinary review panels, I think, is really critical on the topic of climate change and especially for climate change and health. And I think that's a limitation. And I think that's been holding back climate change and health science in Canada. If you look at other places like European countries or the United States, they're so much further ahead of us in terms of climate change and health research. And I think that's one of the reasons why. Interestingly, in the early 2000s, Canada was the world leader in climate change and health research. And we've fallen off of the international landscape. And I think that's partly because of funding. So for example, in the United States, the National Academy of Medicine has recently launched a signature initiative on climate change and health, where they're going to even try to even further bolster this type of interdisciplinary review panels for this topic to try and more effectively mobilize funding to this type of research. I think the other area that's really critically important is education. So there's been a lot of different studies that have been published looking at climate change and health education everywhere in the world and globally. we're falling short. We're not providing the training that's needed for health professionals, both primary healthcare providers, public health providers, and even at the most at a more like primary level in public schools, we're not providing that education either. And so while other countries have started increasing their climate change and health education, including the United States and the UK, I think that Canada has a long way to go. And that's documented in the peer-reviewed literature.
So do you have any sense as to why that is? Like, why has Canada fallen behind? Are we prioritizing other things, or, this is my question. I'm curious on your take on it.
I mean, I think that would be a really interesting study to see. Some of the research that in terms of education that has been done, there have been studies that have looked at this for Canada, and a common response is we acknowledge that it's important, and we have people to teach it. We just haven't got around to making that happen and to like adjust the curriculum. And I think that that's reflective of a very complex and complicated post-secondary or higher education landscape and ecosystem right now. In terms of the other questions, I'm not sure. I mean, there was a period of time where Canada had, some of the leading climate change and health experts in the world, and they were government scientists, and a lot of the government scientist positions have been culled, and that could also be part of it, but I couldn't say for sure. But I would suspect that some of it goes back to that.
Yeah, no, there's a question in the chat here from Celia that says, does the Ipcc report explore which solutions are most impactful and can most quickly bring us to a climate resilient future?
Yeah, they do. So that there's across sectors, this analysis is done, and across region it's done. So the chapters are divided into sectoral chapters. So things like food, there's a food chapter, there's a water chapter, there's an ecosystem chapter, there's an ocean chapter, there's these different sectoral chapters. And then there's also different regional chapters. So there's a North American chapter, there's an Africa chapter, there's a Europe chapter, there's an Asia chapter, and so on. And so in all of these chapters, you'll see different adaptation strategies assessed for feasibility and also for effectiveness. And what they also take into consideration is enablers and barriers across sectors and across regions. So if you're interested in a certain sector or a certain region, if you check out the underlying chapters, there'll be a specific section that addresses that in detail, including for health. But I think that in the end, a lot of it comes down to things like financing and support. We found that in general, adaptation strategies are stuck in planning stages and not really moving into implementation stages fast enough. So trying to provide supports to enable doing that, thinking about maladaptation and addressing some of those root causes of vulnerability is something that came up a lot too. So generally, those are some things that came up as enablers and important for successful adaptation.
Okay, another question popped up. First of all, Hussein says, thanks, a great presentation, and then asks, climate change discourse is extremely important, but could also be overwhelming to people. Do you think the increased climate dialogue might have a negative effect on mental health? If yes, how could we ensure that people are adequately informed about climate change, but their mental health is not heavily impacted?
I mean, I think that this is a really important question, and it's something that as authors we discussed regularly through the 3 years, especially because as it was becoming clear what our key findings were. I think that like the UN had called this this report as like the Atlas of Human Suffering or something like that. That's not what we wanted it to be dubbed. We wanted it to be dubbed things are really bad, but we know we have the solutions. We just have to act. And that's, I think, an important piece of the messaging. So it's critical, I think, that people understand what's happening and that the science on that is now like unequivocal. Like there's consensus about it. We know it's happening. It's very, very clear, but we also know what to do about it. So it's important to communicate both sides of that, because if people don't understand that like scientific certainty of these risks and impacts that we've already observed and that we're projecting to happen in the future, it's hard to talk about the urgency of the action that's needed. So there's those two pieces, and then the third piece that we talked a lot about as authors, and that there's, this is an entire area of research, is the importance of talking about climate change day to day. And that's important to inspire climate change action, but it's also really important for mental health and wellness, so that people, because there is a sense of like isolation, of feeling helplessness, of feeling alone in the context of this big global problem, and the importance of talking to others about it, and finding common ground and coming together on these topics is also shown to be something that's important to inspire climate change action, but also to help with that, some of those emotional responses that we have in the context of climate change.
Okay, great. So I see the questions are slowing down in the chat, so I'm going to ask one more of my own. What was the experience like? Is there anything that you reflect back on, any stories that you mentioned the very hectic last few weeks of your life, and maybe share a little bit of that with us, and that'll be our last question for today.
For sure. I remember when I was invited to be an author, some of my mentors said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Because it's a lot of work, and it's one report. So it's been like, this report has been like 3 years of my life, and I've spent so much time on it. It's taken an enormous amount of time. At the same time, it's been some of the most rewarding work and enjoyable work that I've done. Like, I mean, it's so amazing to be able to work in a field that you can work across disciplines like this. For the past 3 years, I've been working with climate change modelers and climate change anthropologists, and people who work on the economy and climate change and infrastructure and then climate change, and the effectiveness of seawalls and climate change. Every single discipline or specialty you can think of that intersects with climate change, these people from around the world have been coming together to talk about it. And I've just learned so much from other disciplines. And I feel so lucky to have had the opportunity to do that and to make those connections and meet those people. So that has been amazing. The past 2 weeks, I mean, this is the second time that I've been part of the Summary for Policymakers approval session, where you negotiate with governments on how to most clearly communicate these things. And it's incredibly exhausting. There's very little sleep. But it's also such a cool opportunity to see the science policy interface, because it becomes very clear what governments care about, what different governments care about, like what research actually matters to them in their decision making, what content in the Summary for Policymakers is actually going to matter in the COP27 negotiations. Who cares about what and why? And so as a researcher, having that insight into government priorities is really, really a fascinating process.
Yeah, I can imagine. That would be really interesting. So I think that, those are the questions. I see lots of thank yous popping up in the chat. So let me also say thank you. This was fantastic. I learned a lot. I know our audience did as well. And hopefully now you get a bit of a break so that you can get some rest and catch up on the 2 weeks of sleep that you've missed. So thank you very much, Sherilee, for taking the time today.
Thanks so much.